August 2010. Deep inside a Chilean mine, 33 men were working nearly 700 meters below the surface, and in a single moment, their connection to the world disappeared. No sunlight, almost no food, no way to know if anyone was even looking for them. For 69 days, survival came down to one thing: discipline. This is not just a story about rescue, it's a story about how long humans can endure when hope itself becomes uncertain. Northern Chile is defined by absence. The Atacama Desert stretches inland from the Pacific coast, a plateau of rock and dust shaped by geological time rather than weather. Rain is rare. Vegetation is sparse. The land is stable, dry, and quiet, giving little indication of the forces that exist beneath it. Several hundred kilometers north of Santiago, near the city of Copiapo, the San José Mine sat embedded in this terrain. From the surface, it appeared unremarkable, an industrial site marked by access roads, conveyor belts, and ventilation structures. Beneath it, however, the mine descended more than 700 meters into the earth, following veins of copper and gold through fractured rock. The mine had been active for decades. Its tunnels were narrow and irregular, carved through hard stone by drilling and blasting. Temperature increased with depth. Air circulation depended on mechanical systems. Light existed only where it was brought in. Above ground, the surrounding desert was still. The mine operated on routine schedules. Shifts changed. Equipment moved in and out. There was no immediate sense of instability, no visible warning on the surface. Inside the mountain, work continued as it had the day before. The tunnels held their shape. The rock walls appeared fixed. For those entering the mine that morning, the descent was familiar. The environment did not signal danger. It offered only silence, weight, and depth. This was the setting before the collapse. A remote landscape, a functioning mine, a structure that appeared, at least on the surface, to be holding. The San José Mine began operations in the late 19th century and changed ownership several times over its lifespan. By 2010, it was operated by the San Esteban Primera Mining Company. The mine extracted copper and gold from deep underground, relying on a network of access ramps and tunnels that extended hundreds of meters below the surface. Its productivity kept it open. Its safety record was uneven. In the years before 2010, the mine had been cited repeatedly by Chilean regulators for structural instability and safety violations. Rockfalls were not unusual. In 2007, a fatal accident led to a temporary closure. Operations later resumed after corrective measures were reported, though concerns remained among workers and inspectors. The men working at San José came from different regions of Chile. Some had decades of mining experience. Others were younger, supporting families through contract labor. Their ages ranged from early 20s to late 50s. They worked as drill operators, machine operators, electricians, mechanics, and supervisors. Mining was familiar to them. Risk was part of the profession, though not always equally distributed. For many, employment at San José was a practical decision. Mining wages were higher than most alternatives in the region. Copiapo and the surrounding Atacama towns depended heavily on extractive work. Leaving the industry often meant leaving the area entirely. The mine's internal organization followed standard procedure. Crews descended at scheduled times. Work was assigned based on specialization. Communication underground relied on radios and fixed systems. The reception varied by depth and tunnel alignment. An emergency refuge existed near the lower levels of the mine. It was designed to provide temporary shelter in case of an incident, stocked with limited food, water, and oxygen support. It was not intended for long-term habitation. Its purpose was to allow survival for a short period until rescue or evacuation could occur. On the morning of August 5, 2010, 33 men descended into the mine for their shift. Some had worked together for years. Others knew each other only professionally. There was no ceremony marking their entry, no indication that this shift would differ from those before it. They entered a place they understood, a place that had carried risk in the past but had always released them again. At that moment, the mine was still operating, The routines were intact. The assumption of return remained unchallenged. By August, winter settled lightly over northern Chile. At the surface, temperatures in the Atacama cooled during the night but remained stable during the day. Underground, seasonal change had little effect. The environment inside the mine was constant warm, enclosed, and controlled by machinery rather than climate. The working level where the 33 miners were assigned lay approximately 700 meters below ground. Access was provided by a spiraling ramp wide enough for vehicles descending gradually into the mountain. The ramp served as both an entry and exit route, as well as a critical line for ventilation and emergency evacuation. Daily routines underground followed a predictable pattern. Equipment was checked. Drilling continued along mapped veins. Loose rock was cleared. Communication with the surface occurred intermittently, depending on signal reach and operational demands. The structure of the San José Mine reflected its age. Older sections were reinforced with metal supports and concrete. Newer areas relied more heavily on the surrounding rock for stability. The geology of the mountain was complex, with fault lines and fractured zones that required constant monitoring. Near the active work area, the emergency refuge was located off the main tunnel. It consisted of a reinforced chamber sealed from the surrounding rock. Inside were basic supplies, a limited quantity of canned food, drinking water, first aid materials, and equipment intended to sustain workers for no more than a few days. Ventilation systems were connected to the surface, though their reliability depended on the integrity of the mine above. At the time, no official evacuation order had been issued. Work proceeded as scheduled. Inspections had not indicated immediate collapse. While miners were aware of past incidents, the conditions that day did not appear unusual. Above ground, supervisors monitored operations through standard reporting. The mine's entrance remained open. Vehicles moved in and out. There was no emergency response in motion. The descent that morning ended as it always had. The men reached their assigned level. Machines were powered on. The tunnel walls stood intact. The mine, for the moment, continued to function. The separation between surface and depth remained absolute. Those underground had no reason to expect that the access ramp, their sole path out, was about to become unusable. The environment offered no clear warning. The routines held. The shift moved forward. At approximately 2003 in the afternoon on August 5, 2010, the stability of the San José Mine changed without warning. A massive rockfall occurred near the access ramp, deep within the mountain. An estimated several 100,000 tons of rock fractured and gave way, collapsing into the main passage. The sound reached the miners first. A low vibration traveled through the tunnels, followed by a sudden release of force. Dust filled the air. Lights flickered. The access ramp, the only direct route to the surface, was blocked almost instantly. No single point of failure could be identified at that moment. The collapse was the result of accumulated geological stress within fractured rock, amplified by years of excavation. The mountain shifted inward, sealing sections of the mine behind dense debris. The men attempted to assess their position. Communication systems were disrupted. Vehicles could not pass. The ramp was no longer navigable. The path they had used to descend that morning no longer existed in usable form. Some miners were working closer to the collapse zone. Others were deeper in the mine. Movement toward the surface was attempted, but the obstruction was complete. Rock fragments continued to fall intermittently, making approach unsafe. Within a short period, it became clear that self-evacuation was not possible. The mine's internal layout offered few alternatives. Secondary shafts did not reach the working level. Emergency exits were limited and, in this case, inaccessible. The group moved toward the emergency refuge. It was located away from the main ramp and designed to withstand a structural stress. Reaching it required navigating through darkness and debris, but it remained intact. Once inside, the scale of isolation became apparent. The refuge sealed them off from falling rock, but it also sealed them away from the surface. Ventilation was uncertain. Supplies were finite. Above ground, the collapse registered as a loss of contact. Attempts to reach the miners by radio failed. Initial assessments could not confirm their location or condition. By the end of the day, the mine was silent below the collapse zone. The mountain had closed. The separation was complete. From this point forward, time underground would no longer follow routine. The assumption of return had ended. Survival, rather than work, became the central condition. The emergency refuge sat beyond the active work area, cut into solid rock and reinforced to withstand localized collapse. It was designed as a temporary shelter, not a place of residence. Its purpose was limited and practical, to keep miners alive long enough for evacuation. Inside, the space was confined. The ceiling was low. The air was warm and humid. The chamber contained a small cache of supplies, food, water, and medical materials, calculated for a short stay. The quantities reflected assumptions that no longer applied. The miners took inventory. The food consisted mainly of canned tuna, crackers, and small portions of milk. The water supply was minimal. There was no natural light. Illumination came from battery-powered lamps and headlamps, which had to be conserved. Ventilation systems were present, but unreliable. The collapse had damaged sections of the mine above, affecting airflow. Oxygen levels fluctuated, heat accumulated. The temperature in the refuge rose well above surface conditions and remained there. Order was established early. A senior miner assumed coordination responsibilities, not through formal authority, but by experience and necessity. Decisions were made collectively, with emphasis on discipline and predictability. Food was rationed immediately. Each man received a measured portion, far smaller than normal intake. The group agreed on strict schedules. Meals were taken at fixed times to preserve routine. Physical movement was limited to reduce energy expenditure. Lights were used sparingly. Waste was managed as carefully as the space allowed. Medical concerns were addressed with limited resources. Several miners had pre-existing conditions, including diabetes and hypertension. Medications were rationed alongside food. Monitoring became informal but consistent, relying on observation rather than instruments. The refuge provided protection, but it also imposed confinement. There was no way to know if rescue efforts had begun, no confirmation that anyone on the surface knew they were alive. The psychological weight of that uncertainty settled quickly. Days were not marked by sunrise or sunset. Time was measured by routines and by diminishing supplies. The men understood that the refuge could not sustain them for long under normal conditions. Despite this, there was no immediate panic. The focus remained narrow. Each action was directed toward extending time. The objective was simple: remain alive until contact could be made. Outside the refuge, the mine remained unstable. Occasional tremors could still be felt through the rock. The shelter held. The men stayed where the structure was strongest. This was not a solution. It was a holding pattern. Survival depended on restraint, cooperation, and endurance qualities that would be tested far beyond the refuge's original design. The first days passed without communication from the surface. Radios did not work. There was no signal through the rock. The miners could not determine whether rescue efforts were underway or whether the collapse had been detected as anything more than a loss of contact. The environment inside the refuge remained constant. Temperatures hovered above 30 degrees Celsius. Humidity increased as ventilation faltered. Sweat accumulated. Clothing stayed damp. The air felt heavy, particularly during periods when oxygen circulation weakened. Rationing became stricter. The original food supply had been calculated to support a small number of people for a few days. Divided among 33 men, the portions were reduced to a few spoonfuls per day. A single can of tuna was split among several people. Crackers were broken into fragments. Milk was diluted with water. Water was measured precisely. Consumption was limited to what was necessary to prevent dehydration. Physical activity was minimized. Rest became the dominant state. Hygiene presented a challenge. There were no proper sanitation facilities. Waste was managed using containers and sealed areas as best as possible. The process was controlled to reduce odor and contamination. Discipline extended into every aspect of daily life. Sleep patterns changed. Without natural light, circadian rhythms weakened. Some men slept in short intervals, others stayed awake for long periods. Fatigue accumulated unevenly. The absence of external reference made time feel compressed and indistinct. Health concerns increased. Heat exhaustion was a constant risk. Blood sugar levels became difficult to manage for those with diabetes as food intake declined. Minor injuries healed slowly. There were no serious accidents during this period, but vulnerability increased. Psychological pressure remained contained but present. The men avoided discussions about worst-case outcomes. Conversation focused on routine tasks, memories of daily life, and practical matters. Maintaining order was considered essential. Above ground, multiple rescue plans were being considered, but none had yet reached the depth where the miners were sheltering. Drilling attempts faced unstable rock and equipment limitations. These efforts were invisible to those underground. By the end of the second week, the refuge had become a closed system. Supplies were nearly exhausted. The miners understood that survival now depended on a change beyond their control. They continued to wait. The structure held. The mountain remained silent. The separation persisted. As the days extended beyond the limits the refuge had been designed for, survival shifted from conservation to adaptation. With food nearly gone, the miners reassessed what remained usable in their environment. Condensed milk and small quantities of oil were stretched further. Any edible material was divided precisely. Nothing was discarded. Physical conditioning became deliberate. Complete inactivity led to weakness and disorientation, but exertion increased dehydration. Short, controlled movements were introduced. Simple exercises were performed in place to maintain circulation and muscle tone. The effort was measured and consistent. Mental structure mattered as much as physical discipline. A daily schedule was maintained despite the absence of clocks. Tasks were assigned. Equipment was checked. Conversations followed predictable patterns. These routines created a sense of progression where none existed. Leadership remained stable. Decisions were discussed but implemented uniformly. Disagreements were addressed quickly and quietly. The group avoided fragmentation by emphasizing collective survival rather than individual need. Light was managed carefully. Headlamps were turned on only when necessary. Darkness became the default condition. Over time, eyes adjusted. The space felt smaller, but familiarity replaced initial discomfort. Perception of time continued to distort. Without external markers, days blended together. The men tracked duration by counting meals and rest cycles. Estimates varied, but the effort to mark passing time provided orientation. Health management relied on observation. Signs of heat stress, confusion, or physical decline were noted early. Water distribution was adjusted when needed. Medication was allocated with caution, prioritizing stability over comfort. There were no attempts to force escape. The access ramp remained blocked. The rock mass above showed no sign of shifting enough to reopen a route. The refuge was still the safest location. The psychological environment remained restrained. Fear was present but controlled. There were moments of silence that extended for hours. There were also periods of conversation that served no practical purpose beyond maintaining connection. Above ground, drilling operations were advancing slowly through unstable rock. Underground, the miners could not hear this progress. They continued under the assumption that rescue was uncertain. Adaptation did not improve conditions. It only prevented collapse of order. The margin between survival and failure remained narrow, defined by discipline rather than abundance. The routine held. The mountain remained unchanged. The wait continued. As the period underground extended into weeks, the physical and psychological margins narrowed further. The body adapted to reduced intake, but at a cost. Weight loss became visible. Strength declined gradually. Movements required more effort than before. Heat and humidity remained constant. Ventilation was inconsistent. At times, oxygen levels felt lower, producing headaches and fatigue. These episodes passed, but they increased awareness of fragility. Psychological strain intensified quietly. The absence of information from the surface created a sustained uncertainty. The men did not know if drilling efforts were close or if attempts had failed. There was no feedback loop. Hope and doubt existed without confirmation. Minor conflicts arose but were contained. Irritability increased with exhaustion. Leadership focused on maintaining calm rather than resolving every disagreement. Silence was often used deliberately to prevent escalation. Health risks became more pronounced. Those with chronic conditions required closer monitoring. Medication supplies were nearly exhausted. Food intake remained minimal, just enough to sustain basic function. Sleep continued in irregular patterns. Time perception weakened further. Days were no longer counted reliably. Memory of the surface environment faded. The refuge became the entirety of experience. The outside world existed only as recollection. Above ground, drilling attempts encountered repeated setbacks. Equipment failures and rock instability slowed progress. Multiple shafts were started to increase the chance of success. These efforts consumed time and resources, but remained invisible to those below. Underground, the miners prepared for uncertainty rather than rescue. Conversation shifted toward endurance rather than outcomes. The possibility of prolonged isolation was acknowledged without emphasis. The refuge continued to hold structurally. No further collapses reached the chamber. The mountain remained still, but the sense of enclosure intensified. This phase marked the deepest strain. Supplies were nearly gone. Physical decline was measurable. Psychological pressure was sustained rather than acute. Survival depended entirely on factors beyond the refuge. The men remained where they were, conserving what little remained, waiting for contact that had not yet come. On August 22, 2010, 17 days after the collapse, a drilling probe broke through into the refuge area. The sound was faint but distinct. It was the first external signal the miners had perceived since the mine sealed itself. A note was attached to the drill bit and sent back to the surface. It confirmed that all 33 men were alive. The message was brief and factual. It established contact without elaboration. Communication systems were introduced gradually. Narrow tubes allowed the delivery of food, water, medical supplies, and written messages. These channels also carried air and information. The immediate crisis of starvation ended, but confinement remained. Rescue planning shifted from discovery to extraction. Engineers determined that a shaft wide enough for evacuation would be required. Multiple drilling operations continued simultaneously to reduce risk. Progress was slow. The rock was unstable. Precision mattered. Underground, conditions improved incrementally. Nutrition was restored in stages to avoid medical complications. Medical professionals on the surface monitored the miners remotely. Instructions were followed carefully. Activity levels increased gradually. Time regained structure. Days were measured by deliveries and communications. The refuge remained occupied while preparations continued. The men were informed of the process in restrained terms. No timelines were guaranteed. In October, a rescue capsule was lowered through the completed shaft. It was narrow, designed to carry one person at a time. The ascent would take nearly an hour per individual. Extraction began on October 13, 2010. Each miner was secured and lifted to the surface in sequence. The process was controlled and methodical. There were no deviations. The final miner emerged on October 14, 69 days after the collapse. The mine was then sealed. The rescue concluded without loss of life. It ended the period of underground confinement, but not the physical or psychological effects of the experience. The mountain released them slowly. The operation closed the shaft with care rather than haste. Following the rescue, the San José Mine ceased operations. Investigations into the collapse examined geological conditions, safety practices, and regulatory oversight. The site was eventually abandoned. No further mining resumed there. The 33 men underwent medical evaluation and recovery. Weight loss, dehydration, and stress-related conditions were treated over time. Long-term effects varied. Some returned to mining, others did not. Public attention faded gradually. The event entered the historical record as a case of prolonged underground survival and large-scale coordinated rescue. It demonstrated the limits of emergency infrastructure and the consequences of operating in unstable geological conditions. The refuge, designed for short-term emergencies, had become a space of endurance. Survival was not the result of extraordinary resources, but of restraint, order, and time extended beyond expectation. There was no celebration built into the conclusion. The mine closed. The men returned to the surface. The desert remained unchanged. The Atacama continued to hold its silence. The mountain stayed where it was. The site became a marker of what occurs when routine meets failure and when survival depends on systems holding longer than intended. The story ends without emphasis. A collapse occurred. 33 men remained underground for 69 days. They were recovered alive. The mine did not reopen. That is the record.